Imagine knowing a storm is coming, but the warning arrives too late to act. That is exactly what happened with U.S. intelligence and Japan's secret signals before the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the tense months leading up to December 1941, Japan had devised a sophisticated system to communicate critical information to its embassies and military units worldwide. This system, known as the code, was a carefully constructed set of encrypted signals meant to alert Japanese diplomats about impending hostilities. By transmitting specific code phrases in diplomatic messages, Japan could quietly indicate its readiness for war without alerting foreign powers. The WINS code was more than a mere communication tool. It was a strategic instrument designed to prepare Japanese personnel globally for rapid mobilization. The coded messages could convey subtle instructions, such as whether to break off diplomatic negotiations, prepare for evacuations, or commence military operations. These signals were intended to operate under the radar, bypassing conventional channels of scrutiny and ensuring that Japan's intentions remained concealed from adversaries like the United States. On December 6, 1941, Japan transmitted a WINS code message indicating a break in diplomatic relations with the United States. The message essentially served as a warning that Japan was on the brink of war, signaling to Japanese officials that military action was imminent. However, due to delays in transmission and decoding, this vital information did not reach U.S. intelligence personnel in time to affect preparations at Pearl Harbor. The failure to act on this warning highlights a critical flaw in the intelligence system of the time. Analysts had partial information about Japan's hostile intentions, but bureaucratic procedures, communication lags, and incomplete understanding of the WINS code's significance prevented timely action. Even though the code itself had been partially understood, the delayed reception and interpretation meant that the warning arrived too late to prevent disaster. U.S. intelligence had been aware, in broad strokes, that Japan was preparing for possible conflict. Military attachés, cryptographers, and diplomatic channels all provided fragmented insights into Japanese movements and intentions. Yet these pieces of information were never fully synthesized into a coherent warning system that could trigger proactive measures. The WINS code message, had it been acted upon promptly, could have heightened readiness at key bases such as Pearl Harbor, allowing commanders to implement precautionary measures that might have mitigated the scale of the attack. Adding to the problem was the inherent complexity of Japanese communications. The United States had made significant progress in intercepting diplomatic messages, but military codes, operational orders, and strategic signals remained difficult to decode. Analysts faced enormous challenges. Not only did they need to break encrypted text, but they also had to interpret context, intent, and timing accurately. The WINS code, while partially understood, required precise interpretation, a task made more difficult by the fact that key phrases and alerts were often embedded within routine diplomatic communications. The systemic limitations extended beyond decoding. Once messages were received, they had to pass through layers of military and civilian bureaucracy before reaching decision-makers with the authority to act. This chain of communication introduced further delays, reducing the window of opportunity to prepare for imminent attacks. In essence, even when intelligence signals were technically intercepted, the mechanisms to respond effectively were insufficiently agile to prevent disaster. Moreover, the Japanese meticulously planned the timing and method of their communications to minimize detection. They intentionally created ambiguity in their diplomatic signals, ensuring that foreign intelligence services could not easily distinguish between routine communications and critical alerts. The WINS code was a part of this strategy, subtle, sophisticated, and designed to challenge even the most capable cryptanalysts. The Japanese recognized that any misstep in communication could compromise operational security, so the code was carefully crafted to be difficult to interpret without intimate knowledge of the system. In retrospect, the delayed interpretation of the WINS code underscores the human and technological limits of intelligence in the early 1940s. Cryptography was still an emerging science, and intelligence infrastructure lacked the speed and integration needed to act on fragmented signals in real time. Analysts were trained to decode messages, but the ability to synthesize, prioritize, and act on intelligence before it became obsolete was limited by both organizational structure and technology. 10. The WINS Code, a missed warning. During the months leading up to December 7, 1941, U.S. intelligence was monitoring a variety of Japanese communications, including diplomatic and military signals. One system that had attracted particular attention was the WINS Code, a prearranged method by which Japanese diplomats could indicate major changes in international relations. The code consisted of subtle phrases embedded in routine messages, designed to alert Japanese embassies about imminent hostilities or the severing of diplomatic ties. The WINS Code operated on a simple principle. Certain key words or sentences in Japanese diplomatic communications signaled specific actions. For instance, messages about the wind direction from various locations, northeast, northwest, southwest, served as warnings of different diplomatic or military developments. While the system itself was ingenious in concealing sensitive information within mundane text, it also depended heavily on precise transmission and timely reception. Any delay or misinterpretation could render the code ineffective. On December 6, 1941, Japanese diplomats transmitted a message using the WINS Code that effectively communicated the planned break in diplomatic relations with the United States. This message was one of the final steps in the lead-up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, the warning embedded in this transmission did not reach U.S. intelligence personnel in a manner that allowed for preventative action. The delay was caused by a combination of transmission lag, bureaucratic processing, and incomplete analysis of the message's content. At the time, the responsibility for monitoring Japanese communications was divided among multiple agencies, including the Army's Signal Intelligence Service (SIS) and the Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence (ONI). Each agency intercepted, decrypted, and analyzed different sets of messages, which meant that no single entity had a complete picture of Japanese diplomatic intent. The fragmented nature of intelligence reporting contributed to the failure to recognize the significance of the WINS Code message. Even when portions of the code were partially understood, analysts faced challenges in interpreting the context. The WINS Code required not just translation, but careful consideration of timing, phrasing, and geographical references. Some messages contained references to other Japanese operations, adding complexity to an already intricate puzzle. Without a comprehensive understanding of these nuances, U.S. analysts were left with ambiguous signals, unsure whether they indicated routine diplomatic matters or an immediate military threat. Another factor that complicated the intelligence picture was the sheer volume of intercepted messages. Japanese embassies and consulates regularly transmitted a high number of diplomatic communications, many of which were mundane. Sorting through this volume to identify critical alerts demanded significant manpower, time, and expertise. Analysts were tasked with distinguishing between routine correspondence and messages containing encoded warnings, a task that proved difficult given the limited resources and the novelty of such cryptographic systems. The interpretation of the WINS Code also relied on collaboration between military and diplomatic analysts. While cryptographers could decipher the technical elements of the message, understanding its strategic implications required input from policy experts and senior military leaders. Unfortunately, this process was slowed by hierarchical communication channels and bureaucratic procedures that hindered rapid response. By the time the message indicating the severance of diplomatic relations reached decision-makers, it was already too late to implement comprehensive preventive measures. Compounding the issue, Japanese operational planning included measures to maintain secrecy and minimize detectable signals. Military commanders and diplomats coordinated carefully to avoid revealing the timing and location of potential attacks. The WINS Code itself was part of this broader operational security strategy. By embedding warnings in seemingly innocuous diplomatic messages, Japan reduced the risk of early detection while ensuring that its own personnel were prepared for hostilities. The delay in acting upon the WIN's code message was therefore a result of both technical and organizational challenges. U.S. cryptographers and intelligence analysts were capable of decoding portions of Japanese communications, but the combination of ambiguous phrasing, complex coding methods, and bureaucratic inertia prevented timely action. Additionally, the assumption among some military and civilian leaders that Japan would avoid a direct confrontation with the United States contributed to a sense of complacency. This underestimation of Japanese intent reduced the urgency with which decoded messages were treated. Intercepted signals and cryptography failures. In the months preceding the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. intelligence agencies were heavily focused on intercepting and decoding Japanese communications. The Army's Signal Intelligence Service (SIS) and the Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence (ONI) were tasked with monitoring Japanese military and diplomatic messages. While considerable progress had been made in understanding certain Japanese diplomatic codes, the operational codes used by the Imperial Japanese Navy, particularly the JN-25 system, remained largely unbroken. JN-25 was the backbone of Japanese naval communications. It consisted of codebooks combined with additive ciphers that allowed messages to appear as random sequences of numbers. The complexity of the system, with periodic changes to codebooks and additive keys, presented significant challenges to U.S. cryptanalysts. By late 1941, the United States had made some headway in deciphering portions of the code, but they were far from reading full messages or predicting specific operations. Intelligence collected from intercepted signals provided fragmentary insights into Japanese naval movements, but these insights were often ambiguous. Analysts could sometimes detect general fleet positions or ship departures, yet they lacked detailed knowledge of timing, target selection, or strategic intent. The Japanese fleet that would strike Pearl Harbor maintained rigorous radio discipline, ensuring that messages were minimized and coded. This operational security made it extremely difficult for U.S. intelligence to track their approach in real time. Efforts to piece together the movements of the Japanese fleet relied on triangulation of radio signals and the comparison of intercepted messages over time. Analysts noticed unusual patterns and increases in Japanese radio traffic, suggesting preparations for action. However, these observations were not enough to pinpoint the target of the operation. The signals indicated that movement was occurring, but did not clearly identify Hawaii as the focal point, nor did they provide an exact timeline. Compounding the problem, information derived from intercepted messages had to pass through multiple layers before reaching commanders with decision-making authority. The flow of intelligence involved translation, cryptanalysis, and dissemination across Army and Navy channels. Each step introduced potential delays or misinterpretations. Even when analysts correctly identified unusual activity, the fragmented reporting structure often prevented the information from being synthesized into a coherent assessment of immediate threat. In addition to cryptographic challenges, analysts faced technical limitations in signal interception. Radio equipment of the time had limited range and sensitivity, and Japanese transmissions were often brief or sporadic to avoid detection. Analysts could record messages, but environmental factors and interference sometimes caused partial or corrupted reception. These gaps in data further hindered the ability to anticipate precise Japanese operations. Coordination between different intelligence branches also presented challenges. While the Army focused on certain diplomatic and military codes, the Navy concentrated on operational messages from the Imperial Japanese Navy. This division meant that information relevant to strategic threat assessment was scattered across departments. Attempts to integrate Army and Navy intelligence were ongoing but imperfect, leading to situations where critical details were not combined in time to form actionable intelligence. The partial successes in breaking JN-25 provided some clues, such as general indications of fleet maneuvers, but these clues were often interpreted conservatively. Analysts were aware that Japanese forces might undertake offensive operations, but assumptions about target selection and timing were cautious. There was a prevailing belief that Japan would not risk a direct strike on a major U.S. naval base, which reduced the urgency with which ambiguous signals were treated. Meanwhile, Japanese planning emphasized strict operational security. Fleet movements were conducted with minimal radio traffic, and when communications were necessary, they were heavily encrypted. This meant that even with an alert and active intelligence network, U.S. analysts were left with incomplete and often inconclusive information. The approach of the Japanese task force across the Pacific remained largely undetected until visual confirmation would have been possible, leaving very little time for defensive action. Despite these challenges, intercepted signals did provide some valuable insights. Analysts recognized increased coordination and the assembly of significant naval assets, suggesting preparations for a major operation. However, without precise decoding of operational messages, the U.S. was unable to determine the specific location, scope, or timing of the planned attack. This incomplete picture of the threat contributed to a false sense of security at Pearl Harbor, where ships were moored closely together and aircraft were lined on the airfields, unprepared for an immediate strike. The reliance on signals intelligence also highlighted the limitations of early cryptography efforts. Unlike modern surveillance and satellite reconnaissance, the United States in 1941 depended heavily on human analysis of intercepted transmissions. This meant that even small delays in processing or interpreting messages could result in missed opportunities to act. Analysts worked tirelessly to break the codes and alert commanders, but the technological and procedural constraints of the time limited their effectiveness. Japanese radio discipline played a key role in maintaining the element of surprise. By minimizing transmissions and using secure channels, they ensured that even when signals were intercepted, the content could not be reliably decoded. Additionally, the Japanese fleet's approach took advantage of geography, moving through routes that avoided predictable monitoring paths. Combined with U.S. cryptographic limitations, this made it extremely difficult to detect the task force until it was already close to Hawaiian waters. Ultimately, the intelligence failures surrounding intercepted signals and cryptography illustrate a combination of human, technical, and procedural shortcomings. Analysts had access to partial data, but the inability to synthesize information quickly, interpret coded messages accurately, and predict operational targets resulted in a lack of actionable intelligence. These limitations directly contributed to the surprise and effectiveness of the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the aftermath, investigations emphasized the need for improved coordination between intelligence agencies, faster cryptanalysis processes, and a more proactive approach to interpreting ambiguous signals. The lessons learned from the interception and analysis of Japanese communications informed post-war developments in signals intelligence and cryptography, underscoring the vital importance of integrating technology, expertise, and communication in national defense. The combination of unbroken codes, strict Japanese operational discipline, and organizational challenges meant that U.S. intelligence could not anticipate the precise nature of the threat at Pearl Harbor. While efforts to monitor, decode, and interpret signals were underway, these measures were insufficient to prevent a devastating surprise attack that would forever alter the course of World War II. The attack and its aftermath, a nation in shock. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Japanese fleet launched a meticulously planned attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The assault began in the early hours, catching American forces largely unprepared. Aircraft carriers were absent from the harbor, but the ships and personnel present faced overwhelming aerial bombardment. Bombs and torpedoes struck battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, while Japanese fighter planes strafed airfields, causing widespread destruction of aircraft on the ground. The human toll was staggering. Over 400 Americans were killed, and more than 100 were wounded. The attack destroyed nearly 20 naval vessels, including 8 battleships, and damaged more than a dozen others. Over 300 aircraft were destroyed, crippling the air defense capabilities of the Pacific Fleet. The scale and precision of the attack left the nation in shock, revealing vulnerabilities in U.S. military preparedness, despite ongoing intelligence efforts. Investigations following the attack revealed critical lapses in intelligence, preparedness, and coordination. Although U.S. agencies had intercepted messages and had indications of Japanese hostility, the fragmented nature of intelligence analysis prevented effective action. The Army and Navy were operating under separate channels, and communications between departments were slow and cumbersome. Warnings that were available did not reach the appropriate commanders in time to influence defensive measures at Pearl Harbor. One of the most significant findings was the failure to act upon intercepted signals and partial code decryptions. Analysts had noticed unusual activity, increased radio transmissions, and some preliminary indicators of Japanese fleet movements. One of the most significant findings was the failure to act upon intercepted signals and partial code decryptions. Analysts had noticed unusual activity, increased radio transmissions, and some preliminary indicators of Japanese fleet movements. However, the lack of full decoding of operational codes and the absence of decisive interpretation meant that these warnings were not translated into actionable intelligence. In essence, U.S. forces had glimpses of the threat, but lacked the clarity and authority to act upon it effectively. Another factor contributing to the surprise was complacency based on strategic assumptions. Military leaders believed that Japan would not risk a direct attack on a major U.S. naval base so far from its home territory. This assumption, combined with incomplete intelligence, created a sense of overconfidence. Defensive protocols at Pearl Harbor were insufficiently stringent, with limited readiness for a full-scale aerial assault. Ships were moored closely together, aircraft were lined up on runways, and anti-aircraft guns were not fully manned, all of which magnified the impact of the attack. The immediate aftermath of the attack brought the United States into World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress on December 8, calling December 7 a date which will live in infamy. Congress responded by declaring war on Japan, marking the nation's official entry into the global conflict. The attack on Pearl Harbor not only devastated the Pacific Fleet, but also galvanized national sentiment, uniting the country in resolve and prompting a massive mobilization of military and industrial resources. Beyond the immediate military and political consequences, the attack exposed systemic weaknesses in U.S. intelligence operations. The inability to fully synthesize signals intelligence, interpret cryptographic data, and coordinate across agencies highlighted the need for reform. Subsequent investigations emphasized several key lessons. First, intelligence agencies must communicate more effectively and integrate information to provide actionable assessments. Second, cryptographic and analytical capabilities must be continually advanced to keep pace with emerging threats. Third, assumptions about enemy behavior must be regularly tested against evidence to prevent strategic surprise. In response to these findings, the U.S. undertook significant reforms in its intelligence and defense systems. Coordination between the Army and Navy was improved, with greater emphasis on joint intelligence operations. Cryptographic efforts were expanded, leading to enhanced capabilities in code breaking and message interpretation. Intelligence sharing protocols were streamlined to ensure that critical information reached commanders promptly. These changes laid the groundwork for more effective operations later in the war, including successes in the Pacific Theater, where timely intelligence played a decisive role. The attack also spurred developments in early warning systems and military preparedness. Radar technology, although in its infancy at the time of Pearl Harbor, was recognized as crucial for detecting incoming threats. Anti-aircraft defenses and base readiness procedures were overhauled, and training for personnel in rapid response and contingency planning became a priority. Lessons from December 7, 1941, emphasized that intelligence and preparedness must work hand in hand to prevent catastrophic losses. In addition to military reforms, the attack prompted broader shifts in policy and strategy. The United States increased its focus on global situational awareness, including monitoring diplomatic and military developments in regions far from its borders. Intelligence agencies expanded their scope, incorporating signals, human intelligence, and reconnaissance efforts into a more integrated system. The recognition that early warning and proactive measures could mean the difference between success and disaster became a guiding principle for American military strategy. The legacy of Pearl Harbor continues to influence modern intelligence and defense practices. The attack serves as a case study in the consequences of delayed action, fragmented analysis, and assumptions about enemy intentions. Analysts and historians have repeatedly emphasized that possessing information is not sufficient. The interpretation, communication, and decisive use of intelligence are what ultimately determine outcomes. The lessons learned from December 7, 1941, shaped the evolution of U.S. intelligence infrastructure, cryptographic capabilities, and operational protocols for decades to come. In conclusion, the attack on Pearl Harbor was not only a tactical and human tragedy, but also a profound intelligence failure. Fragmented signals, incomplete code breaking, and delayed warnings created conditions for a surprise that had far-reaching consequences.